Hi, can you hear me? No? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll preface by saying I'm sorry I don't have findings, but lots of pictures of flowers and beetles. I'm second year of my PhD here at Newcastle, and I'm looking at how the North East industrial past is supporting nature recovery in England. So the North East was really important for coal mining. Coal mining was a dominant industry in and around Newcastle throughout the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries. In 1913, when the industry was at its peak, the region produced a quarter of the UK's coal every year. A lot of the collieries made up the Great Northern Coalfield, which stretched from North Northumberland all the way down to Durham. So it was a major producer of coal for the country. However, from the 1960s onwards, most of the collieries began to close as industry collapsed. So you can see this map here showing the blue dots where collieries are open, red dots where they're closing. So by the 90s, only one colliery is still open. Today, no collieries, no open cast coal mines are in use, but this has still had a huge impact on the surrounding landscape. So when mining finishes, often sites are actively restored. So this means the soil is levelled out, topsoil is put on, and seed mixtures are scattered over. Often these sites are reverted to arable land and also conifer plantations. One such site, which is up near Morpeth, is West Chevington. So this is a huge restored former open cast coal mine, closed in the 90s, restored in the early 2000s, and recently taken over by Northumbrian Wildlife Trust in the last few years. Initially, this site was a mixture of rough grassland, arable fields and conifer plantations. But they have ambitious plans to rewild the site and turn it into the most ambitious rewilding lowland project in the North East, and the first of its kind on former open cast coal mines. So these are some of the habitat opportunities that the Wildlife Trust are hoping to produce on the site. Currently there's a mixture of grassland, woodland, low-quality arable land, and a series of ditches and streams. They want to produce lots of broadleaf woodland, create species-rich meadows, and develop a network more of naturalised wetland and drainage systems. So they have ambitions for these different habitats, but they're using quite passive rewilding methods. So having quite a hands-off approach, seeing what habitats come up, but hopefully some form of this mosaic of habitats. So this is part of the Durridge living landscape. So this is a network of sites all around the Durridge Bay area. Most of them are former open cast coal mines, which the Wildlife Trust are hoping to restore, connect wildlife across the landscape and benefit biodiversity both for people and nature. So one of these other sites, East Chevington, to the right of West Chevington, just near Durridge Bay, is another site I'll talk about. This is another former open cast coal mine, which was restored by the Wildlife Trust in 2003. This is a really important site for birds. It has 2 large lakes and a great reed bed system, supports a lot of migratory and ground nesting birds, but particularly the marsh harrier. So the marsh harrier really relies on the reed beds. It first spread on this site in 2009, which is the first recording for Northumberland in 130 years. The grasslands are also really important for a range of birds as well as plants. So the grasslands support 5 species of orchids, 21 species of butterflies, and other birds like barn owls, skylarks, and grasshopper warblers. So West Chevington and East Chevington are both examples of novel ecosystems. So these are ecosystems which have been changed so much by human use, whether this is through industry or climate change or species moving in, that they have created their own unique ecological assemblages that don't fit any historic baselines. So when these novel ecosystems or these are restored, so when degraded ecosystems are restored, often it's hard to restore to a baseline, an ecological baseline, and you have to work with the new complex communities you have and often manage the sites for their unique ecosystem services and functions. So targeted management of these novel ecosystems could help support nature restoration targets in England. Half of this graph is missing for some reason, but we currently have ambitious plans to restore 30% of our land and sea for nature by 2030, and also to create 500,000 hectares of wildlife-rich habitat. However, currently, a recent report shows that we're only effectively protecting 3% of sites for nature. So we've got a long way to go to meet these targets. However, there's new ambitious policies, such as biodiversity net gain, which could help us meet 30 by 30. So biodiversity net gain, you might have heard about it. It's a quite complex policy. The basis of it is it requires any new building development to create a 10% gain of biodiversity for a minimum of 30 years to compensate for what's being lost. So this can be done on the site that's being developed on or off-site through habitat banks. So landowners can be paid to restore areas of land to compensate for development happening elsewhere. Some organisations, such as the Wildlife Trust, are making use of off-site gain. They're seeing it as opportunities to help manage and restore some of their reserves. This is a map showing some of their delivery sites across the country that they can potentially use BNG to help support local nature recovery strategies and England's wider general nature recovery. So BNG is based on a metric which uses habitat retention, enhancement and creation to create a gain of biodiversity. This metric is quite horrific, but I will try and walk you through it. So it starts with the baseline unit. So you put in information about what is on the site currently. So the size of habitats, the condition they're in, whether they're poor quality, good quality, the strategic significance, which means if any of the habitats fall in existing wildlife corridors or any local nature plans, and also the distinctiveness, which is automatically inputted in the metric, and it's basically an indicator of how special or rare the metric thinks this habitat is. So habitat like ancient woodland would be high distinctiveness, whereas bare ground would have a low distinctiveness. You then project 30 years into the future, and you say by creating and enhancing different habitats, what habitats you'll have on the site, and this gives you the gain value. So BNG's here, but it's got a lot of controversy, a lot of scrutiny attached to it. This list could be endless, but I've highlighted some of the main criticisms surrounding BNG. Firstly, BNG is works on a national scale. It's an English policy, but doesn't take account for habitats that might have higher values in certain localities. So, for example, woodlands score very highly on the metric, so you're incentivized to create them. But this could be unsuitable for areas where, say, native heathland would provide more ecological resilience for that local community. There's concerns about there being a huge funding and skills gap around BNG. So nearly 3/4 of local planning authorities have said that they don't have the adequate skills in ecology to deliver BNG, and nearly 4/5 of them say it's their most challenging policy to implement. The metric doesn't take into account landscape level features such as connectivity between different habitats, as well as the age of the site, which do influence biodiversity quite a lot. And the main point, which I will be touching on in the next few slides, is that BNG is overall a habitat-driven approach. So you're not getting information about other important dimensions of biodiversity, especially for functionally important groups. One of these, which is pollinators. So there's been emerging studies looking at what BNG might mean for different functional groups. Jeff Ollerton, who researches pollinators, has some criticisms about BNG. Pollinators are a wide group of different species of insects. They have very different life histories, very different needs of resources and habitats. This means they need resources year-round in many different ways to fit the requirements of this triangle. So they really need a mosaic approach to habitat creation, but currently in the metric, only urban habitats incentivize this. Pollinators also really rely on core plant generalists. So these are plants which a lot of different pollinator species visit. So these are your things like your daisy family, your thistles, your docks. These, however, in the metric, reduce the condition score that you can give to a habitat. They're seen as low quality indicators of habitat. So really important for pollinators, but not given good values in BNG. There's currently also no grassland in irreplaceable habitats in the metric. So ancient grasslands are a really important habitat, especially for pollinators, with its fungal diversity, but isn't considered here. Another study, this is by Natalie Duffus at Oxford, has looked at how BNG might affect ground invertebrates. They found that there was no correlation, no relationship at all between different invertebrate groups and the habitats they're in and the metric scores they're given. They also found there was no relationship between the metric scores and the carabid, so the ground beetle species richness and diversity. They also found that there were a variety of biodiversity action plan species, so these are like nationally or locally rare and important species across all their different habitats. But this ranged from habitats which the metric said were very low distinctiveness and condition to very high. So this indicates that the metric is not a good assessor of where rare species may be. Finally, another study has looked at how BNG might affect plants, birds and butterflies. They did find that there was a significant relationship between plant diversity and the BNG metric condition scores. However, there was no relationship for bird and butterfly diversity and the metric condition distinctiveness values. So this study really recommends that there needs to be species-focused conservation management in order for there to be gains for a range of taxa, a range of organisms in a landscape. So tying all these ideas together, in my PhD, I'm looking at how the restoration of post-industrial land in the northeast can contribute to off-site gain in England, then looking at how this can feed into national habitat and restoration targets, and looking at what this actually means for biodiversity on the ground, particularly for invertebrates, vegetation and soil. So I spent last summer starting to carry out my fieldwork across 4 different sites. 2 of them are owned and managed by Northumbrian Wildlife Trust, so West Chevington and East Chevington, which I mentioned before, 2 really large former open cast coal mine sites. I was also working on a couple of sites in Gateshead. These are owned by Gateshead Council and are part of 9 small urban nature reserves that they're potentially using for off-site gain. These are former quarries, a lot smaller than West and East Chevington, but interesting little places. As I mentioned before, I don't have results yet, but I'll show you what I've been up to in the field. So firstly, for soils, in the field, I was looking at the structure and texture of the soil, so breaking it up, seeing how crumbly it is, how big the aggregates are. I was conducting earthworm counts. This machine at the top is measuring the carbon dioxide emitted from the soil. And quite often when I would be looking at the profile of the soil, I would find little clumps of coal, like you can see in the bottom image there, which is a really nice reminder of the kind of living history of the landscape. I took some samples back to the lab for kind of basic chemical elemental analysis to look at the metal content, the moisture, electrical conductivity and such. I've also started to look at microbial respiration, so that's the little boxes, the little wells up there. So that's measuring the carbon dioxide emitted from the microbes in the soil to get an indicator of the abundance of the microbial life. For invertebrates, one of my key focus groups is pollinators. So I'm really interested in the plant-pollinator interactions in my landscapes. So I conducted pollinator surveys to look at what plant species, different insect species are visiting. It was a very wet and cold summer, so not the best summer for pollinator surveys. Across West and East Chevington, I only got 4 bees, which is very sad, and a lot of flies, which I'm still unsure what I'm doing with. Still processing all my samples, but it seems at the moment that I have a lot more diversity from the Gateshead sites, and I don't know whether that's due to maybe I was visiting these sites on sunnier days, or there's more spillover from gardens as their urban sites. But yeah, I'm interested to see what findings I get and if there is a significant difference between the pollinator interactions on my sites. I was also looking at ground invertebrates, so this is following on from the paper I mentioned earlier. So I put out pitfall traps, which are little cups in the ground that bugs fall into, across my sites. Due to the wet conditions, I got a lot of slugs, a lot of gloopy slugs, a lot of spiders, crane flies, which I'm hoping to look at like the abundance of these different insect groups, but also look further at the diversity of the carabits. So just from a slight initial look at my beetles, still need to ID them in detail. It seems the majority are Nebria brevicollis, which is a very widespread, very common beetle, which you would expect to find in most landscapes. I also got quite a few Pteristicus. This is an important natural predator of pests in agricultural systems, so it's often the farmer's friend. And I also got a couple of these really nice shiny metallic beetles. I don't know what they do in the landscape, but they're nice to look at. I was also conducting vegetation quadrats, so this is quite a steep learning curve trying to ID my grasses. Most of the fields I was visiting were neutral grassland, so they had very similar plant compositions. But got some lovely orchids, scarlet pimpernel, speedwell and such. I had a couple of arable reversion fields as well, which changed rapidly between the 2 months I visited them. So it was interesting to see the change in vegetation there. I did get a lot of what the metric would refer to as species indicative of suboptimal condition. So this is things like your creeping buttercups, your docks, your clovers. But as I mentioned before, these can be really important for pollinators, and I saw a lot of the flies and the few bees that were there visiting these buttercups. So whether that is indicative of bad quality, who knows? So to sum up, post-industrial landscapes have really unique ecosystems, but they need to be managed carefully in order for biodiversity to benefit. And biodiversity net gain could offer ways to restore and protect these landscapes and to contribute to national nature targets. But it's really important that to acknowledge that different taxonomic groups have very different needs in the ecosystem, and this needs to be taken into account when the BNG metric is being used to assess biodiversity. So I'd like to thank my big supervisory team, especially Elisa, who's my lead supervisor, my collaborative partners, funders, and the NHSN for their field skills training and helping with identification. Thanks.